So President Biden has now issued a new executive order on dealing with firearms. Would be his third, I believe, since he took office. The first two were pretty wide-ranging and significant. The ghost gun ban and the pistol brace ban, which will affect really millions of people. This one is interesting. It deals primarily with federal licensing for firearms dealers and who will have to obtain that license if they want to sell guns at all. And it also deals with a number of other things, FTC report on gun marketing. There's an initiative about the DoD trying to implement policies to affect how guns are sold in the United States potentially. There's a number of other smaller initiatives in there as well. ATF records on federal licensees who've had some sort of violations. They're going to try to release some of those records. There's a kind of a wish list in here of what gun control advocates have wanted for a while in different areas. But I'm interested in your overall take first on what you think this means. Is this as significant, as aggressive as the previous two executive orders that the president put out?
Well, I think it's trying to be as aggressive as the president can be at this point. He sort of used up a lot of his available tools with the last two recent rule changes with the ATF. And so there's not a whole lot more that realistically he can reach for. Though I think the extent to which this can be viewed as aggressive, if you will, is really going to depend on what these actual rules look like. The way that these executive orders work is that the president just sort of says, hi, agency X, Y, and Z, I want you to promulgate a rule doing this, or to issue a report doing that, or to take strides to do this general idea. But then the agency itself has to go and promulgate that rule, which we don't know what that means or what that looks like until we actually get it. Now, with some of these, I think there is certainly a potential that the agency ultimately could come out with a rule that is quite problematic. But there's also potential that it turns out to be a big nothing burger, if you will, and it really just depends. But that's I think what's interesting is how far it could potentially go once we get those agency rules out.
Yeah, I think that's a good summation of what we're seeing here, right? It's not like the previous two where he was, of course, the details of the rulemaking process and those mattered quite a lot as well, but it was fairly clear straight from the go that he was going to push these policies as aggressively as possible with trying to redefine what a firearm is, to eliminate, basically homemade firearm making tools and parts, and then that he was basically going to try and reclassify pistol braced guns as subject to the National Firearms Act and all the complications that come along with that for people who already own them, including potential federal felony charges. But this time around, it does seem like it's less clear exactly what we're going to get out of this executive order and exactly what these directives from the president are going to result in as far as the rules that these agencies come up with. But let's start with what the president focused on, which is this idea of trying to get closer to universal background checks. That's how he put it. He was saying that, within the bounds of current law, we're going to try to get as close to requiring background checks on all sales as we possibly can. And it seems the tactic he's going to use for that is changing what qualifies somebody as in the business of doing of selling guns, and therefore needing a federal license, a federal firearms license, an FFL. What's your view on that rule? How close can he actually push to universal background checks through requiring people to get FFLs?
Yeah, so let's take a step back and talk about just very briefly what federal law currently is, because to a large extent, the president can't just override federal law and unilaterally mandate, well, look, if you transfer a gun, you need to have a background check. So Congress has, for several decades now, already had in place a series of statutes that essentially says if you are engaged in the business of dealing in firearms, you have to get a federal firearms license. And then it tells these FFL holders, anytime you transfer a gun to a prospective buyer, before you do that, you have to conduct a background check, period. And so the question becomes, okay, well, who is or is not engaged in the business of dealing in firearms?
Right.
There is a pretty lengthy definition of what that means. But it's still not very clear. It's not really an objective test, right? Where it's like if you sell 10 firearms this year, you are engaged in the business.
Right.
Or if you made $1,000 last month, you're engaged in the business. It's quite subjective. And so I think the goal here from the Biden administration is to promulgate rules that to the greatest extent possible include the most amount of people as possible under this definition of what it means to be engaged in the business of dealing in firearms, so that if they want to engage in sales or transactions or transfers of firearms, they can't do so as a private seller, because if you're a private unlicensed seller, you can sell or transfer guns to a resident of your same state without a background check and without all of the other record-keeping requirements. And I think the issue here is not necessarily that the president wants thousands more people to go and get their federal firearms license. I think it's really that he wants to sort of put the kibosh on people feeling like they can engage in what would be otherwise lawful sales without going through an FFL because they just don't know.
Right.
So I think that's really where you get this sort of chilling effect. Again, it will be interesting to see what this rule looks like when it comes out, whether it will try to put in some objective factors, something to the extent of, if you sold more than 5 guns, right? If you made more than $500. And I think he has a little bit more room to do that than previous administrations, because if you recall, last year, Congress passed the bipartisan gun safety bill. And as part of that, they just very, very
They changed the definition.
They changed that definition just ever so slightly. It wasn't entirely clear what that definition change accomplished, but I think it gives the Biden administration it gives them room to just sort of latch onto that, to say, well, look, we need to help define and clarify what Congress meant here. And so I think that's where we might run into trouble with this chilling effect.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, right? Because this reminds me a lot of a 2016 executive order from President Obama, where they basically did the same thing. They tried to tighten the interpretation of what it means to be in the business for in regards to obtaining one of these licenses. And even at that point, they said, even if you're just selling one gun, you could be in the business. They didn't, but it still fell back on this sort of. It really comes down to like what they can prove in court, whether a judge will buy that somebody was actually in the business when they sold a gun that DOJ is prosecuting them over.
Right.
And I think that's still going to be largely the case, but I don't think that executive order really accomplished much in practice during the Obama administration. I don't think there was a sea change in how that law was enforced. And I'm skeptical that there will be for this one too. But you're right that there is this extra complication that the definition in the law did change slightly. Basically, they removed the word livelihood. So used to talk about livelihood and profit being your main goal with selling guns. That's when you're engaged in the business. And they really, ATF has a whole list of factors they consider, whether you have a storefront, right? That's a pretty straightforward one. If you have a storefront and you're selling guns out of it, you're probably engaged in the business of selling guns. if you have a business name, you make business cards that
Right.
say Bob's Guns, you're probably in the business, right? If you're going and constantly cycling through guns, just buying them to resell them, to flip them, you might be, that's going to be a factor that they would consider as being engaged in the business. But it doesn't really come down to, in practice, oh, you sold X number of guns or you made this amount of money. Now, this new standard removes livelihood from that definition.
Right.
And so maybe it's more forgiving to the government in this case, and maybe that will be able to implement a broader interpretation of what it means to be engaged. But I don't know. I read those two clauses. You still have to be predominantly seeking profit while
Right.
selling guns. So I don't know how much it's really changed. And I guess that's what will be interesting to see how they approach this